All right, guys, let's see the highlight for YouTube. We're talking about today. And on this particular day, we got a lot of news that crossed the wires. Number one, you should have been anticipating what the news was because it was scheduled just after 9 o'clock. Supreme Court decision on it as to whether or not President Trump has to release tax document, one to the state of New York, the other to Congress. The first one that hit the wires, and first of all, we knew that if they voted that he had to release these documents, it was going to be bearish for the markets. No matter what your political preference is, equity markets want to see Trump reelected, bullish. They want us in an HSE lose, it's bearish. And so this uncertainty created the downside. So you had to know that first of all. And it was catchable. It wasn't one of those numbers that sometimes the algorithms often get. And so this thing broke from 58, all right? And this is the whole point of this highlight that we had today. Number one, we knew what was coming out and we knew how it was going to affect the market. Did we know how much? This much? Nobody did. But you try to pick the beginning of direction and then stay with it. Keep yourself off the wrong side is just as important as predicting the right side directionally. So what we had here was these 58s. Why is that important? Because right at around 11 minutes after 9 Central is when it came across that indeed he had to comply with the New York Supreme Court decision. Bam, we break. It's important because if you stay below there, it's often resistance the first test up. You stay below there, it's still weak. How often have we said that with important news? We call it ground zero, where the market was priced when the news came out. Then something interesting happened. Their next decision was that Congress could not see his tax documents, that they had to be returned to a lower court. So they run up, right? They stop at 52. We don't know it's going to stop at 52 at first, but we do know when it does there, and we know when it does there, and all of a sudden it does there. And then something happened in here where it caught my attention and said, it just made me think, because there was a series of other markets, that equity markets that went down all in there too. Did I predict it was going to go all the way down to where we're at actually right now? Of course not. But directionally, your horns come off. If you think that this rally is going to be respected because of the second decision rendered, you would start questioning it or saying absolutely not, because it went through where it held here and here, ground zero of bullish news. A recap. Ground zero of bearish news was right here. It stops it and is able to continue lower. Ground zero of the bullish potentially news does not hold after one or two times. And the third time it goes through, off to the races. Transitional moments is what price prediction is all about. That's what's important. Trying to put yourself in a position to be bearish before that. So many people are worried about how much downside there can be instead of being close to the beginning of the downside. Don't try to predict how much downside. Try to predict the beginning and closer to the beginning of downside or upside. Because then and only then are you going to be able to catch a part of the move. Too much prediction and you'll never get anything right. All right? So don't try to be perfect. And also don't try to predict too much in this whole model of where markets are going. If you think that there's some pretty good chance at continuation, then you would be, in this case, playing it from the short side. You had news behind it. And at some point in here, we talked about, listen, a lot of people like to fade it and try to buy a bounce, especially if you missed the sell and getting short. You look to do the opposite. And I told people specifically, don't get caught fading this thing. And if you are going to buy it, don't be patient with it. Downside's the right side, and it's going to run you over if you're patient with a long. Next thing you know, you make one decision to get long in here, and then some people add to it, and one dumb decision right here turns into a disaster. All comes from one dumb decision. So all your trades are stupid. Don't put too much value into one over the other. Always know where your risk is before you take a trade. In other words, your second trade first. In other words, know where you're going to get out for a loser before you get in a damn trade so you're not surprised. But work really hard on transitional moments. Work really hard at creating a exercise to see how good you're doing at the beginning of a transition. Because I'm telling you, it won't feel like a good guess when you're right. And all part of transitional moments are knowing where you're wrong. Because I felt like, I think it was back in here, right, guys, that this could be respected as a move back up, and not necessarily way up here, but a move back up, and this low be a temporary low for a while. Well, it was respected with respect to chop, because it didn't just go right back down. It took a while before it returned to its weak side. So you got to know, like, at some point, hey, this isn't being respected. This move isn't being respected anymore. And you got to be willing to admit that you're wrong early, just like you're trying to be right early without being perfect. So the whole point of this, though, as you look back just an hour and a half from the release of the Supreme Court decision, and that's when I'm doing this video, is it's a reprice session. Market doesn't like it for right now. And that 58 even was an important spot because that's where we were. Markets were just kind of neutral, looking to grind, low volume, tight range, middle of the summer, and then this changed it. Another thing that's important in this highlight video that I mentioned during the room was, as the volatility ticked up, and it wasn't out of nowhere, but it went from kind of slow to kind of fast, you had to cut. If you trade multiple contracts, you had to cut your size because you're automatically going to increase your risk. That's a really important piece of advice to people who trade multiple contracts. And if you only trade like one S&P, you can cut your size. Go into the micros. If you only trade one S&P, there is now the opportunity to cut your size. But multiple contracts, either in the micro or the E-mini, you got to cut your size when volatility increases, because you're not going to have a choice but to increase your risk because things are moving a little faster. And you actually want to, because you can be less perfect as volatility picks up. So to summarize again, get better at trying to predict transitions earlier on, but knowing where you're wrong, and don't try to be perfect.